Hello, everyone. This is a video of me going through the cognitive explanation for depression. We've looked at phobias, both the explanations and the treatments, but now we're going to look at depression from a cognitive point of view, right? So phobias is done through behavioristic points of view, depression is done through cognitive points of view, and OCD, which is what we're going to look at next, is looked at from a biological point of view. So like phobias, we actually have to figure out what depression actually is. And I just want to show you the resources that you have available to you that are on the Google site. So this is the Google site for psychopathology. As you can see, it has everything there. And if I just click on explaining depression here, it will take me straight down to this just here. So you have the slides. Let me just use this. You have the slides I'm going to go through today. You've got the screencast, which is currently being filmed just there. A couple of key research sheets, which you do need to know. In this bullet point, there is both Beck and Ellis names. You don't need to know their pieces of research. You need to know their theories for this. So Beck's negative triad and Ellis's ABC model of depression. I'm going to go through that today. What I did want to, you have a couple of university notes just there as well, which are quite useful. But what I did want to start off with is just looking at what the DSM actually says depression is. So I've got this ready already. What we have here is the DSM's classification of what's called major depressive disorder. This is what we think of as depression. In my day, it used to be called unipolar depression, and then you had bipolar. But what we are talking about, because there are loads of types of depression, what we're talking about is the main type of depression. It's cyclical, so it goes in episodes, goes in cycles, is not characterized with any mania or hyperactivity or hyperhappiness. We're just talking about the standard depression, if you will. Now, I think the DSM's supremely interesting. I could read honestly all of this. It's got everything you need to know about depression from a medical point of view. But let's have a look at some of the key aspects. I'm going to start looking at what these symptoms are. Now, for you to actually, and this is quite interesting, for you to actually be diagnosed with depression, you have to be diagnosed with 5 of the following 9 symptoms within the last 2 weeks. At least one of those symptoms has to be either depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. So one of the 5 symptoms has to be a depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. Let me just hold on a second. 2 seconds. Anyway, so the first symptom is a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Pretty easy. That one's what most people think depression actually is. And number 2 is that second one is a loss of pleasure or interest in the things you used to find interesting or pleasurable. So for you to get diagnosed with depression, you need to have at least one of those. Other symptoms that are linked, and you do need to know these, by the way, significant weight loss, and that is a change of 5% up or down within a month. The reason why it may go up is because of comfort eating. The reason why it may go down is because you don't want to eat, social withdrawal, so on and so forth. Insomnia, so where you can't sleep, or hypersomnia, where you're sleeping too much nearly every day. So someone with depression, their sleep is massively impacted. Psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day. So that is just your movements. It's very basics. Basically, just your movements. So someone who's depressed they may have psychomotor retardation, which is basically they're just very slow in their movements. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, caused primarily, possibly by the lack of sleep. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt. diminished ability to think or concentrate nearly every day. The last one is not necessarily guaranteed in any depressive symptom, but is obviously recurrent thoughts of death and recurrent suicidal ideation, or thinking about suicide or even planning one. So those are your 9 symptoms. For you to be diagnosed with depression, you need to have 5 of those 9. There are a couple of other things that's probably worth noting here as well, is that it has to have caused some distress or impairment in your social, occupational, or relationship areas of your life, for example. So what that means is for you to be diagnosed with depression, you need to have it actually affect your life. You need to have it actually affect your life. And there's a few other bits here as well. Now, fine. There's a lot I could go on and read about just here, right? But I would recommend you do it. Maybe not if you have depression. There's the prevalence rates. So if we have a look at how common is depression? The 12-month prevalence of depression in the US is around 7%. 7%. With marked differences in age group. So the ages of 18 to 29 is 3-fold higher than 60 or above. So basically, your age until you're about 30 years old, you are 3 times more likely going to suffer depression than anyone above 60. 7% does seem quite low when you talk about depression hitting 20% of people, but that's 7% of people in a year having depression. Right, but maybe you had depression last year, and you have it again this year. So this is 7% of people essentially newly getting depression, and obviously you don't necessarily have one cycle of depression. So depression does tend to run around about 20%, and females experience a 1.5 to 3-fold higher rate than males. You've got a lot about how it comes around. So look, if we have a look here, recovery from depression typically begins within 3 months for 2 in 5 individuals, or within 1 year for 4 in 5 individuals. So some people respond very quickly to depression. Some people here take a while longer. But generally speaking, a good way to look at this, 80% of people, that's 4 in 5, 80% of people will begin to recover from depression within 1 year. Depression is episodic. It comes and goes. It's not just a constant, right? It's not just a constant. You can have long episodes, sure, but it's not a constant. You do tend to need to get short-term treatment in the form of drugs with a view to then getting long-term treatment in terms of therapy. Let's have a look. And there is also a few other bits just here, culture-related, so on and so forth. Comorbidities. I will just end on this before I actually get to what we need to talk about. Comorbidity, a term you probably haven't come across so far, but comorbidity is essentially disorders that tend to come up alongside depression. Do you think people ever really just suffer depression? That's incredibly rare. Substance abuse related disorders, panic disorder, OCD, anorexia, bulimia, and BPD. These are disorders that come up alongside depression quite a lot. And then afterwards, you've also got a lot of other depression type. So I actually know someone from a few years ago who has this disorder, persistent depressive disorder. That's low-level depression, but more constantly. So it's not kind of like the dips. I can never say it, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. So let's get to actually what I wanted to talk to you about today, which was the cognitive explanation for depression. Not an easy bullet point. Certainly harder than the phobias one that we looked at quite recently. But we're going to be looking at depression from a cognitive point of view. And the main premise of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is that it's faulty thinking that causes depression. It isn't what happens to you. It is faulty thinking that actually causes depression. It's your inability to rationally see things as they are. So it's not what happens to you, it is what you do with that input that makes us different, i.e., makes us depressed or not depressed. So we're going to be looking at Beck's negative triad. Tri means three, and there's three parts to this. But we're also going to be looking at Ellis's ABC model as well. But both of these approaches are exactly the same in that they both say faulty thinking is behind getting depression. So the way we perceive ourselves, the way, our environment, so on and so forth. Fine. Let's make a start. This may not be in your workbook entirely, right? This may not be in your workbook entirely, but it's certainly not the third one, errors in logic. But these are the three things you need to know about Beck 1967. You need to know the cognitive triad, you need to know the negative self-schemas and to be able to name them, but you also need to know the errors in logic as well. So let's start with the negative triad, and that is the triad on the left-hand side. What you've got here is a self-fulfilling style of thinking, and they've all gone negative. If someone believes something negative about the world, actually no, let's start with negative views about oneself. Let's say you think that you are ugly. Let's say that you think you are ugly. Now, that is something you believe about yourself that's probably gone quite toxic. You've not always thought you were ugly. Maybe you thought you were strange looking, but you've not always thought that you were ugly. But it's become more toxic, maybe someone said something to you and maybe friendship groups have got a bit toxic. Basically, you are left believing that you are an ugly uggo. Now, if you believe that, if you believe I am ugly, you are automatically going to think that everyone thinks you're ugly. If you think you're ugly, why wouldn't everyone else think you're ugly? So that is an automatic thought, right? And it's self-perpetuating. This one automatically leads to this one. Now, if you believe negative views about the world, you're going to believe about negative views about the future. If everyone thinks you're ugly, everyone is always going to think you're ugly, right? That's a natural follow-on from that. So you've gone from believing it's just, I believe I'm ugly, to everyone is always going to think that I'm ugly. And basically what happens is these self-perpetuate. They are self-fulfilling. They go round and round and round automatically, and it ends up, and I think I actually mentioned it here. No, I don't, but we'll come to that in a second. Beck believed that depression is caused by the emergence of negative schemas developed by the individual. So these are things that you believe about yourself. In this case, you are ugly. It's thought to be triggered, and again, so this is a little bit environmental here, but it's thought to be triggered by parents in childhood who are quite overly critical, maybe overprotective. So parenting is actually quite heavily to blame here, which is a bit dodgy to blame parents for this. But the problem you have with this is that this is the way you think. You do realize, right, that the way you think is so ingrained in you, it's incredibly difficult to change. If next time you see me, I walk in and say, right, I want you to start being more positive in the way you think. That takes effort, that takes time, that takes a hell of a lot of maintenance. And it's not the quick fix that most teenagers expect to be able to apply to their mental health. Mental health changes take time. Depression is no exception. So in reality, is a drug going to change the way you think? Not really, not particularly. This can only be fixed mainly through counselling or therapy, or if you're particularly strong and motivated and determined, by yourself. These thoughts are believed to be automatic, deeply embedded, meaning that they are not easy to change, but also that they essentially create a negative cycle of depressive thinking that goes round and round and round and round and round. That is Beck's negative triad. Now, this is caused and causes negative self-schemas. Right? It causes and is caused by negative self-schemas. So as it says here, schemas fuel and are fueled by these cognitive biases. And you do need to know a couple of negative schemas that people with depression typically tend to have. So for example, there's something called the ineptness schema. Now, let's just have a brief recap about what schemas are. Schemas are essentially something we believe about ourselves or something we believe about the world, right? If I were to say to you, well, tell me everything you know about your phone, or tell me everything you know about a mobile phone, you would probably describe your mobile phone, because when you think about mobile phones, you'll just think, okay, well, they tend to look like this. They maybe have a cover, for example. They've got a charging point down the bottom. They have a lock screen. Now, it's worth knowing your version of a schema may not actually be accurate. So if I were to ask you to tell me everything you know about giraffes, you may have some things in that knowledge that are not accurate. The reason I'm saying this, the schemas you have about yourselves are occasionally not that accurate. And people with depression have wildly inaccurate schemas about themselves. So the ineptness schema is when people with depression expect to fail. So right now, I just want you to think about, are you a failure in the things that you do? If the answer is yes, you probably have an ineptness schema. You're clearly not a failure. You're at A level, presumably. You're doing A level. You're clearly not academic. You're not an academic failure. So some people have quite toxic schemas about themselves, and that can actually lead to depression. A couple of other schemas that are worth knowing. So these are schemas. These are like a bundle of knowledge about something. So you have self-blame schemas and negative self-evaluation. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated. These schemas fuel and are fueled by, so it's kind of negative cycles of thinking. I've done that terribly, but negative cycles of thinking. These schemas are fueled and fuel by some errors in logic. I think I've changed this. Yeah. These are self schemas. These are errors in logic. Errors in logic are just faulty ways of thinking. So these errors in logic will fuel the schemas, and the schemas will fuel these errors in logic. So they go basically round on each other, and they just fuel each other. So I just want to point out a couple of these. People with depression do not think in rational ways. They think they do, right? They think what they are thinking makes perfect sense, but they don't. For example, someone with depression tends to, and this is well known by the way, they tend to focus on the worst aspects of any situation. So say they get a B in a piece of work, in a really important mock, they would say, well, it's not an A star. It's not an A star. And one thing I say to students is, if I hand someone with depression a piece of work with a U on it, like a U grade, they would think, yeah, I knew that. Yeah, that's right. I'm a failure. If I hand someone with depression a piece of work with an A star on it and they've nailed it top of the class, instead of going, oh, okay, well, I suppose that's quite good, isn't it? They go, no, the teacher was lenient. Everyone else, it was just lucky, for example. It was, hold on. Sorry, Candy had a wasp land on her arm and she decided to throw her phone across the garden. So, I can't remember what I was saying now, but if I hand somebody with an A star work back to them, they'll think any other reason than, oh, I did quite well then. So people with people with depression lock themselves in to a negative way of thinking. Another thing here is they either magnify something or they minimize something. So if something bad happens to them, they magnify it, for example. They make it much bigger than it actually is. Whereas something good happens to them, say they get an A star, they minimize it. They'll go, oh, well, but you got an A star. Oh, yeah, but it's just a mock. It doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't actually go towards anything. So they're constantly locking themselves into this depressive way of thinking. Another thing is negative events are interpreted as their fault. Personalization, for example. I don't know, their friend gets in a fight or something and gets jumped and gets beaten up. People with depression would somehow find a way to think that they are to blame and this is your fault and things like that, and they feel unnecessary and excessive guilt. So these 5 fuel and are fueled by these self schemas, essentially, that I did show you last lesson. There we go, last slide. So they kind of combine. So that is essentially Beck's negative triad. You've got the actual triad just there. You've got some of these schemas, and there are more schemas, by the way, but maybe use these as examples. And you've also got the errors in logic here as well. The other theory I wanted to go through was not Beck, was actually Ellis's ABC model. So the ABC model is the idea that it isn't what happens to you that has an impact on your mental well-being. It's your belief about that event. So if we have a look here, you've got your A. A is activating event. That's where the A comes from, the activating event. So it can be something in your past, it can be something in your present, it can be something that you think of that happens in your future. It can be literally something that has happened to you, or maybe something that even hasn't happened to you. It's an imaginary event, and it can be something that happens inside of you or in your actual environment. So this is the thing that happens to you. You have no actual control over this activating event, right? You cannot control the things that happen to you, largely speaking. What then happens, that goes to be your belief about this. And this is where the depression happens, according to Ellis. This is where the depression happens. You either have an unhealthy, irrational belief about that thing, or you either have a healthy belief about that thing. Depending on which way you go with this is going to have major consequences. So I want you personally to be able to deal with anything that happens to you in a rational, healthy way, not an irrational way, not a rash way, for example. So let's have a look at this. I've got an example. It's quite similar to what we were just talking about. You get a U in your mock. Now, this is something that's happened to you, right? This is your activating event. You have your beliefs. Now, that's either going to be healthy or unhealthy. You hold a belief about this certain event. Now, this here is an unhealthy. This right here is an unhealthy way to process this information. I am going to fail the main exam now. One, that's bullshit, right? That's rubbish, and this person probably does know that on some deep level. I had a student a couple of years ago who I always talk to my groups about, a student called Poppy, and she failed her mock, and I had a massive go at the class, and her reaction was the healthiest I've ever seen. Honestly, it was brilliant. She was like, she cried, she got upset, but after she cried, after she dried away her tears, she was like, I'm not going to let this happen again. I've let myself down. I'm going to hand you pieces of work. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to get my head up. This has really woken me up. And her failing the mock was an incredibly good thing. It was an incredibly good thing because she had healthy ways of dealing with it. She ended up getting an A star or an A. I can't remember what it was in the end, but she went from a U to an A star / A because she had a healthy belief about it. Whereas if you go, oh, I failed the mock. Oh, I'm going to fail the main exam now. Why would you carry on putting in work? Because you think you're going to fail. So your belief is crucial. Your belief is absolutely crucial, and that's going to have the consequences that are either going to be healthy consequences, good consequences, or unhealthy, bad consequences. So the main error that people make here, People with depression place too much emphasis, and note this down, people with depression place too much emphasis on the event that happens to them, not the belief they hold about the thing that happened to them. I would want all of my students to be working on developing healthy ways of processing things that happen to you, even the bad shit, even the bad stuff, failing, breaking up from relationships, for example. I would want you to be working at those. So here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Here's not something that's going to be in the workbook. Right? This is something a little bit extra, but it certainly does actually help. You have, generally speaking, thought to be 3 layers of thinking, 3 layers of thought, if you will. You've got your automatic thoughts. These are the things that spring to mind straight away. You put no effort into these. They are things you have no immediate control over. So, for example, if I put a U grade mock in front of you, what would be the first thought that springs to your mind? At a deeper level is your beliefs, and these beliefs are attitudes and rules, right? So is your intermediate beliefs. So sometimes called underlying assumptions. These rules are usually followed in a typical situation. So if X, then Y. If you get a U, then you're going to fail. Okay, fine. And your bottom layer, your deepest layer, are what are called core beliefs. These are incredibly strongly held beliefs. It is a core belief of mine that any student can get an A star. That is a deeply, deeply held belief that is not easy to change. So automatic thoughts are easier to change because they're at a shallower level. Core beliefs, I've got to see tons of students failing for me to change my belief that anyone can get an A star. So core beliefs are absolute beliefs about yourself, others, and the world. They affect how we see things, and they drive the rules and the automatic thoughts. These core beliefs impact these. And Ellis is essentially saying, in order for you to get depression, any of these can go toxic. Any layer of these can go toxic. The deeper the level, the worse it would be. And any of these would link to depressive symptoms. The deeper, the worse. The deeper the layer of thought that gets toxic, the worse the depression. Imagine if you had a core belief that you were a horrible person, right, to your core. And I'm saying to you, you're a lovely person. You're an absolute lovely person. You wouldn't change. You would go, ding, you changed my whole core belief by saying that. Brilliant, thank you. Right? This is what counsellors will work with. Okay. Worth noting down, by the way. Definitely worth noting down. So the whole point about the ABC model is that people suffering depression place too much emphasis on what happens to them, not the beliefs they hold about them. And I've put here, what is more important, your grade from your mock exams or how you perceive them? Hands down, how you perceive them. Now, a few pieces of evidence, which I'm not going to go through here, but feel free to pause it and go through it. I do want to go through some of the evaluations, but if it's worth noting down McIntosh and Fisher and Costa, it's worth noting them down, but it's all on the screen. There is support for this idea that there are cognitive influences on depression, right? You've just seen in the previous slide. So that is a good evaluation. There is a lot of evidence. Can you get depression through bereavement? Yes. Can you get depression through biological means, low serotonin? Yes, apparently. I don't believe that personally, but yes, you can. Can you get depression through, things that happen in your unconscious? Yes, you can. But there is evidence that you can also get depression through cognitive means. The other thing as well, and I mentioned this in the last one, cognitive therapies are actually quite effective. So Beck and Ellis their theories have then gone on to create cognitive therapies, and these therapies do work, right? But you need to be careful in saying that gives credibility. But anyway, I'm not going to go through that. Doesn't really go through bereavement-related depression. So bereavement being grief. So if somebody in your life who you are close to dies, you suffer depression within a year, it typically tends to be, by the way, you're supposed to be at your weakest a year after this person has passed away, because you've gone through Christmas, their birthday, your birthday, so on and so forth, and then you get to the anniversary. But it's also not, this isn't particularly good at explaining people with bipolar depression. People with bipolar depression, they have incredibly low moments, but they have incredibly high moments as well, where they're hyper and they've got loads of ideas and they want to do all these things. So it's not particularly very good at explaining that. And then finally, another one is that, and this is quite a big issue actually, doesn't actually explain cause and effect. Is there a chance that irrational and negative schemas cause depression, or is there a chance that having depression causes you to have these disorders or these interrupted schemas? So there is a cause and effect issue. So I'd say there's at least 4 good evaluations that you would need to expand on there. Finally, there is a model pill there as well. Feel free to have a look through that. That is what the sort of thing I expect you to write. That seagull is really annoying. But that's it, right? That's quite a long video. I hope that was useful. It's quite a long one, that. This is a tough bullet point to actually go through. So know the AO1 as deeply as you can. Hope it was useful. Peace out.